Uma universidade conectada com o seu tempo, com a ciência e com a formação humana. A Universidade de Caxias do Sul é uma universidade comunitária que tem como missão produzir, sistematizar e socializar o conhecimento com qualidade e relevância para o desenvolvimento sustentável. Conectada com você, sua vida e seus sonhos. Cerca de 100 mil pessoas levam no seu currículo o nome da Universidade de Caxias do Sul. Mas o legado de uma universidade não pode ser só medido pelo número de pessoas que ela formou, mas também pelos conceitos e ideias que ela ajudou a revolucionar, pelas empresas que ajudou a implantar e até mesmo pelos sonhos que ela ajudou a concretizar. A marca da UCS ultrapassou as barreiras do tempo e os limites do espaço. Ela está impressa em milhares de histórias e conquistas e segue sua trajetória de sucesso, preparando pessoas com capacidade para transformar o mundo, criar o novo e antecipar o futuro. Universidade de Caxias do Sul.
Boa noite. Iniciamos a noite saudando todos os presentes na segunda palestra da nossa 20ª Mostra de Iniciação Científica, Pós-Graduação, Pesquisa e Extensão, promovida pelo Programa de Pós-Graduação em Administração da Universidade de Caxias do Sul. Nessa noite, ouviremos a palestra Thinking About the Post-Pandemic City, que será realizada pelo professor Dr. Rayman Mohamed. Sobre o nosso palestrante. O Dr. Rayman Mohamed tem pesquisado tópicos tão variados como as subdivisões de conservação, psicologia comportamental no planejamento, alterações climáticas na China e segurança nos transportes. A sua investigação atual se centra nas intersecções entre o planejamento urbano, transportes e saúde. Ele atuou durante muitos anos como presidente da área de uso do solo, na Conferência Anual da Associação das Escolas Colegiadas de Planejamento. Foi presidente da Conferência Nacional, entre os anos de 2013 a 2017. Rayman é graduado em Engenharia Civil pela Universidade da Guiana, é mestre em Engenharia Ambiental pela Universidade do Sul da Flórida e doutor em Planejamento Regional e de Cidades pela Universidade de Cornell. Antes de passar a palavra para o nosso palestrante, alguns comunicados gerais. Durante a palestra, será disponibilizado um link no chat para preenchimento, que será utilizado para comprovação de presença. Basta clicar e apresentar as informações solicitadas. As perguntas direcionadas ao nosso palestrante podem ser realizadas diretamente no chat e em português. Chamo nesse momento a coordenadora do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Administração, professora Ana Cristina Fachinelli, para que saúde nosso palestrante e lhe passe a palavra.
Obrigada, Mayara. Gostaria de saudar a todos que nos assistem, desejar uma excelente palestra. Nós já tivemos a primeira palestra da tarde hoje, que foi excelente. Esperamos que todos aproveitem muito essa noite. And thank you, Professor Rayman, for sharing your time and your knowledge with us. It is an honor for the graduate program in administration to have your participation in our annual scientific event. Be very welcome. And we hope that our collaboration will progress and last for a long time to come. Well, now we are ready to listen to you. Welcome, Professor, and thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm delighted to do this, and I'm happy to do this. I think it's a wonderful opportunity to have these discussions and share our perceptions about important issues such as these. So I am going to, if I'm off target, let me know. But I'm going to talk a little bit about. I am going to talk about what I think post-pandemic cities will not look like. That's not the correct term. Let me say differently. What I expect will happen to post-pandemic cities. What I expect the future of post-pandemic cities to be like. And I'll start off by saying, I don't know. I think we're all guessing. There are many factors at play, some of them competing, and some of them that need to be coordinated, and how all these things come together, let's say in the next, in a year or 2 years after the pandemic is gone, I think is difficult to predict. I like to think of the future of cities in a post-pandemic world along 4 lines, and I'll talk about each one of these 4 briefly. I'm speaking mostly in a U.S. context, and I'm also going to be making a distinction between very large cities and relatively smaller, less well-known or less well-established cities. So, like I said, I think there are probably 4 factors, some of them interrelated for sure, but 4 factors that are going to drive the future of cities in a post. The first is the political context. And here again, I'm thinking, I like to repeat, I'm thinking particularly about the United States. I think what happens after COVID-19 is gone very much depends on how state legislatures decide to allocate resources. So state legislatures, I think, are going to remain primarily, they are going to primarily have an ex-urban or an urban and a rural orientation as opposed to an urban orientation. And those political preferences are going to have consequences. My guess is that COVID-19 is going to provide incentives or political impetus for states to again favor far out suburbs, those are exurbs, or rural areas over near-in suburbs or central cities. So in that political context, in the first issue, the first score on a political issue, cities lose. Exurbs and rural areas are going to do better, to the detriment of the cities. And again, when we think about these things, at least in a US context, we're thinking about the allocation of resources for infrastructure, for standards of living, for things that might attract people to cities as opposed to exurbs or rural areas. And I just don't see an environment in the United States that is favorable to cities on the political front. So that's one score in which cities will lose. A second issue that I think we need to consider is what I group broadly under technological issues. And here I am thinking particularly about the future of transportation. The fact is, again, at least in the United States, the cost of transportation is falling rapidly. At least since 2006 or so, the cost for owning and operating a car has been going down. And if there's one thing that anybody in the world understands very well, is that we respond to prices, right? And if the cost of transportation is reasonably inexpensive, combined with the fact that with all the new technologies, et cetera, just driving becomes less hassle. Again, that weighs in favor of rural areas and ex-urban areas over cities. So I know this is not necessarily what we want to hear, but again, on this second score, technology, again, rural areas are likely to prevail over cities. And if you like cities and we teach about cities and we care about cities and we care about metropolitan areas, I understand that might not be good news, but I think it is what it is, and we need to acknowledge those facts. So the third area, which is kind of related to technology in some way, but in any case, I think it's certainly needs to be dealt with separately, is about markets for property and prices. So if we think about markets for real estate as an issue, there is good reason to believe that real estate prices in cities will fall sharply. And hopefully, one might expect that would reattract people to cities. But here, I think one needs to make careful distinctions about what cities we're talking about. How market prices adjust will depend on where we start off and the underlying cost of operating and maintaining real estate assets. For sure, to attract people back to cities, lots of the market for real estate and the prices for real estate will have to adjust rapidly. So take a city like New York or Chicago or San Francisco, the poster child large cities. there's probably a lot of room for prices to fall. So that's good news for these cities. If these cities can adjust their prices rapidly, then people might find them attractive. But we need to bear in mind that even within these cities, the cost for maintaining and operating real estate in itself is expensive. It's just expensive to maintain a building in New York City or San Francisco, or the costs that go into operating and maintaining these buildings is very high. So my concern is that even though for sure prices need to adjust and prices need to fall rapidly, there might be a floor in large cities that prevent prices from falling in a sufficiently rapid way to bring people back to cities. The point is the rate at which prices fall, the rate at which cities, particularly large cities, make these adjustments is important. And why is it important? Because once patterns get set in place, once people think or realize or believe that they no longer need to be in New York City or San Francisco or Chicago, once those patterns get set in place, it's really, really difficult to reattract them to the city. So prices need to adjust and adjust rapidly. This can't be, major cities can't stretch this out into the future. And I'm going to repeat my concern though about large cities, which is the cost for maintaining and operating real estate in these large cities is really expensive. So when I say costs need to adapt rapidly, it's not only the rental price. I'm not speaking simply about the rental price that landlords and owners ask for. I'm talking about all the input costs that go into operating these buildings need to fall rapidly. It's probably even more difficult for smaller cities. And when I say smaller cities, I mean relatively smaller cities. I mean post-industrial cities, cities that are struggling to rebuild their downtowns even before COVID-19. It's probably even more difficult for them because my suspicion is that the cost for operating and maintaining real estate was already low. And the input costs for doing these, for operating and maintaining these buildings was also very low. So there isn't much room. That's fine. And if you want me to repeat anything, let me know. I'll be.
Yeah, I think you can go ahead, Professor.
Okay.
Please.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
So all of this brings me to the last point, which is the last factor that I think will affect the future of cities, which is culture. All right. Again, there's a distinction between larger cities and smaller cities. Larger cities with lots of culture will win on this account. They've got good culture. They've got good cultural resources to attract people back to the cities. So I think for larger cities, the ultimate determinants of how they will fare in a post-pandemic world will depend on the first three factors: the political issues, the technological changes that are favoring living further away from cities, and the third issue being how quickly their real estate prices can adjust. For smaller cities, there's probably a difference between a short-term and long-term effects. What one can imagine a future where in the short term, young people or people in general are so starved for things to do after, let's say, a year of doing nothing. They swarm back into cities immediately after the pandemic goes away. But when we say that, or that's certainly a distinct possibility. I think there's going to be a resurgence in people wanting to do city things after the pandemic ends. But bear in mind that suburban cities, exurban cities, are not going to be sitting around doing nothing. I fully imagine that this year, in which central cities are having a hard time, that these exurban cities and suburban cities are taking full advantage of this and positioning themselves to be competitive, to attract the same young people that central cities are trying to attract. So, and moreover, we don't know what the next fad for young people will be. Up until the 1990s, it was walking in the malls, right? Young folks hung out in the malls, right? In the last 10, 15 years, it was about being in downtowns and enjoying the life that central cities provide. I don't think we should assume that preference for downtown living and the amenities that come with the kinds of culture that young people like that comes with central cities, that somehow that preference is going to remain. We don't know. And it's a really serious consideration. We just can't assume that people 2 years from now are going to like the same things or want to do the same things that people up until last year or up until March wanted to do. Like preferences change. The way people think about how they want to spend their time and their money change and could change very rapidly. So I think at least for smaller cities in this case, for them to be able to compete with suburbs and exurbs, with attracting young people, they're going to have to figure out what the next fad is. I shouldn't call it a fad. It might be a sustained preference. There might be sustained preferences that younger people have, but smaller cities need to figure this out and figure this out quickly so that they can be ready for when the pandemic ends. And the preference for younger people, 2021, might be lots of green space. It might be eating outside and not going into restaurants, but doing all your activities on the outside. It might be turning roads into green spaces. It might be providing more opportunities for biking and for walking. We don't know, but certainly cities need to be working on this now and be preparing for those eventualities. So this fourth score of culture, how what will happen in a post-pandemic world is more complicated. Larger cities will do well because they've got established cultural institutions, and how the future of these cities, how it plays out, will be a combination of how cultural habits of culture within technology and markets, the market for real estate, and also political forces that will influence how that works out for larger cities. But larger cities are probably better positioned, at least when it comes to cultural activities. For smaller cities, they'll need to start thinking now about how to attract younger people back to the cities. And as you can imagine, again, for smaller cities, this will depend on how that all interacts with culture and technology, and how that all interacts with politics and markets and technology. So I know that's not a definitive answer. And it isn't, because I think when we try to predict the future of cities with any certainty, it's not very helpful, because It's just a very uncertain world. If I were a city administrator, I would work on the things that I could work on, which is thinking about what young people like or will like in 2021. I would think about immediately starting up pilot projects to learn from them, to see how you might apply the lessons from these pilot projects in 2021. So, for example, pilot projects like setting up spaces, creating more green spaces, finding ways for retailers to be able to open their businesses and maintain their businesses in cities, and supporting retailers and doing those things are things that cities, smaller cities, need to get started on now. And I do want to emphasize a point that I made earlier, which is, well, they need to move rapidly. Because if 2021 comes around and cities aren't prepared to welcome and accommodate younger people back into cities with things that they want to do, patterns will be set in place. The older exurbs in the suburbs are surely not sitting around doing nothing. They're also preparing for a post-pandemic world. And once you lose out to them, it's really difficult to recapture that population. So I'm going to end there, and I would be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Okay, Professor. Thank you very much for your explanation. I think it was very, very, very good. I believe that, I don't know if somebody has already... Alguém tem alguma pergunta, pessoal? Daí eu já posso... Escrevam no chat que eu passo para ele. Tá? But in the meantime, Professor, I'm waiting if the people, if they have some question.
That's
okay, but we can talk also. I was thinking about the cultural issues that you spoke about. The cultural. Do you think this cultural issue has to be coordinated by any specific sector, like public system, or which system, which stakeholder do you think would coordinate it? The industry, the government, the academy? What do you think about this coordination?
So I think there's both the roles to be played by everybody. Certainly when you think of larger cultural institutions that attract people to cities, especially large cities, if we're thinking, for example, of museums, that's more a I'm not sure how museums are run in every city, but my suspicion is that it's more a not for profit type activity. Very capable of responding quickly and doing what they need to do to keep their businesses going. But certainly assistance and frameworks that are set by the local government are very, very important. Whether it is promoting the use of restaurant space or eating space on sidewalks or on roads, and making that really, really easy to do, providing grants to restaurants to be able to buy heating tents in the winter and placing them outside, developing green spaces that make eating on the outside easier and better. So at the center of this, there's no doubt that a local government policy and actions would be very important. And I think once we get those right, and we work on getting them right, it'll make other things like cultural institutions or the private sector, it'll make it easier for them to respond quickly.
Okay. Professor Anna, I don't know if you want to talk or just in the chat. Let's see. But also, another question, just to think about the technological thing, Professor. We are here in a city that the auto industry is very hard. In the country, the United States is with auto industry very important. What do you this movement to public transport, do you think is something that in the future could improve, could be better? Or what do you think about the transport situation? Just about cars, or also about the public system, public transport? And later I have a question from Professor Anna, but just about this. Okay.
Sure. Well, I do worry about public transportation systems, again, because once people get accustomed to not using them, so many people are using cars now, and it becomes very difficult to attract people back to these systems. I'd have to say that as much as get public transit back up and running, public transit agencies need to figure out ways, need to provide confidence building measures for people to improve the transportation system. So, they could start implementing new filtration systems in buses and subway cars, etc., and advertising these, and making it a point in advertising the fact that public transit systems are safe. We have to find ways to keep public transit systems affordable for people to be able to use as an alternative to cars. And here is where that politics thing that I mentioned earlier is one factor that will determine the future comes into play. It's in the United States anyway, it's a very political issue about resources and funding for public transit. And unless there is public support and political support for public transit, especially since maybe retrofitting these buses to ensure they've got advanced filtration systems and people gain confidence in them, etc., is going to be expensive. And I don't have confidence in the fact that that state governments and state legislatures, as they are currently construed, are politically predisposed to provide the resources that are needed. So that's a long answer. Bottom line is, in smaller cities, I'm not very confident about the future of public transit unless we can really make a strong case for them, and we can try to get prices right so that people who live in far-out exurbs and use roads are encouraged to or are required to pay the full cost of those public roads that are built and maintained for which they're not paying sufficient costs. So anyway, it's a long answer, Rafael. And I see the question here by Professor Anna.
Yes.
So in the United States, I want to say that generally, even though for sure there are members in academia, there are some academia, there are a good bit of academia or some parts of academia that engage in advocacy, and certainly in urban planning that is a practice-oriented field, we can make a difference by speaking out on these issues and publishing on these issues. But I also need to be realistic and point out that at least in the United States, I think on the whole, academia has less influence over the public discourse and decision-making than politicians themselves. It's hard to make cases to politicians in a politically divided society where a lot of ideology is what drives decision making by politicians. It's not like you can present objective studies and believe that politicians will take them seriously and then respond accordingly. Unfortunately, that's not the way it works. The most we can do is write our editorial pieces or opinion pieces in the public press, in the print press, etc., and hope that those messages get across.
Okay, we have.
And be ahead of the curve in trying to predict what young people might want in the year 2021 or 2022 or 2023 and start providing them very, very quickly. And again, all of this is mediated by prices. We can't deny the existence of prices and markets. So prices and markets within cities will have to be competitive with real estate prices in suburbs and other exurban areas.
Okay, we have also another question here from Luana Falcini Costa, or doctorate student. Congratulations and thank you, Professor Mohamed. You talked about attracting people to cities, which I believe is really important. I would like to hear from you too about how cities are preparing to meet the needs of people who have remained in their cities, with few possibilities for economic participation.
So the question is how cities can meet the needs of people with limited opportunities for economic participation. Oh, that is very difficult. And I don't mean to be going back to the political issue, but as you probably know, there is a major divide in the United States between cities that are that contain large populations of minority populations versus the suburbs and the exurbs that contain larger white majority populations. And providing opportunities for people in cities therefore becomes a very, very political issue. And it's very difficult to do. But there is no doubt, absolutely no doubt, that we need to devote more resources to underserved, poorer communities in cities to provide them with more opportunities. It can be as basic as a better public transportation system, all the way up to providing jobs for people who need them. Well, I'm sure there are very many avenues to do this, but I think there are probably two opportunities that arise. One is infrastructure projects that can provide jobs for poor people, but ultimately it's finding ways to support the private sector so the private sector can hire these people, or can hire people in general with good wages and good benefits. And to do that, again, cities need to ensure that their cost structure is not onerous. If you've got all kinds of things that add to the cost of doing business, your businesses are going to find ways to relocate elsewhere. You can think of government projects to help people find work, but you also have to think about government policy that helps to attract and retain businesses within cities.
Okay, we have also a question here from Swelling Weber. Thanks, Professor Rayman, for your explanation. We see centralities discussions more often these days as an answer to urban problems, long-distance traffic, services that are far from home or work, the cost of public infrastructure to get to everyone. Do you believe centralities development is a good strategy to improve quality of life for citizens and also save public money as long as infrastructure assets are more concentrated?
So, repeat the questions at the end.
Do you believe centralities development is a good strategy to improve quality of life for citizens?
What kind of development?
Centralities development.
What's that?
I think you don't have this. To have sub places, not only in one place you have everything downtown, for example. You have this split in other places of the city. Do you think the public system and commerce and services in other places, not only in one place? Do you think it's a solution for urban problems?
Sure. I don't know if it's a solution. That's a strong word, but absolutely. Again, if we think of cities in the United States, if we think of Detroit, where I'm in, it's not only about downtowns and attracting people to downtowns, but strong neighborhoods. So neighborhoods in which people can live and walk to some urban amenities, neighborhoods that are safe, neighborhoods that provide opportunities for people to shop locally. In other words, these are neighborhoods that are not about attracting somebody from the suburbs on a Friday night or a Saturday night. These are neighborhoods for people to live in, right? It's not about attracting young fancy people. It's about families being able to live in these neighborhoods and function in these neighborhoods. So absolutely. But there's a distinction to be made, and I think it's a careful distinction to be made, which is that cities rely on both this thriving downtown that has yuppie people and young people and parties and whatever it is that young people do. Cities need that, and cities also need strong neighborhoods. You can't have one only. I think large cities or even smaller cities need both of those features, and it's very important to have strong neighborhoods. We're not going to do well without strong neighborhoods. Absolutely not.
Okay, I think this is the last question. It's quite similar for the swelling question from Ricardo Cunha da Costa. What's the new trend regarding the model of cities that concentrated work in downtowns and housing in neighborhoods? Will the workplace be much more decentralized?
right? So if the workplaces will be more decentralized, yeah, it seems like that's the case. And if the question is whether or not some workplaces might go out into the suburbs, some offices might be relocated to the suburbs, that's certainly already the case in the United States. It has been that way for many decades. And COVID-19 will certainly accelerate that. However, I do think there's a limit to how much of that will happen. So in the United States, there are all kinds of predictions. There are predictions that 50% of the workforce of people who come in from the suburbs to work in the city are going to work in the suburbs. They're going to, or work at home, sorry. They're going to continue to work at home. Some large percentage of people is going to continue to work at home and never return to the workplace in the city, or come to the workplace of the city only occasionally. And then even offices are going to move into the suburbs. Two comments. One is, we don't know exactly how much of that is going to happen, right? There still will remain forces that encourage skilled people to meet in dense areas. There's still going to be forces that encourage agglomeration, right? I'm sure you've heard the term agglomeration. All the positive externalities that come with hanging out with skilled people, those positive externalities are going to remain. And that's going to create pressure still for people, for educated, skilled people to congregate. But some of the workforce is going to be lost from central cities. What that number is, we don't know, right? I suspect it might not be as high as we think it might be, or as some people are saying. That's one comment. A second comment is that, as you've probably heard, and you probably are doing it in Brazil yourself, everybody's working from home, and there's lots of studies that say when we're working from home, we're just as productive and we're doing well by working at home, etc. That's probably true. But the danger for countries like the United States is if you can work in Kansas City, small old city, as opposed to work in San Francisco. So you can do your job in San Francisco or New York City, but you can do it on a much lower cost place like Kansas City. That's true, right? That's true. But pretty soon your employer is going to be asking the question, if you can work from Kansas City and do your job just as well, there's probably somebody in Rio de Janeiro or Mumbai or Lagos, Nigeria, or somewhere else in the world that knows English, that's got a good internet connection, that can also do your job, right? So if I were somebody who's happy at the fact that I can work in San Francisco, that I can work in Kansas City, as opposed to going to work in San Francisco, I'd be very worried. I'd be very worried that my boss is no longer going to need me. I mean, if you don't need me to come into the office, why do you need me? Why do you need to see me? Why do you need me to pay a high salary in dollars? Why, if somebody can do the job remotely, well, if they can do it in Kansas City, they can just as well do it somewhere in India, right? And I worry about that. I worry about the loss of white-collar jobs, because if you don't need to be in the office, you don't need to be in the office. And if I were somebody doing my job in Kansas City now and being happy about it, I would really seriously, I would think seriously about this and say, I should tell my boss I actually need to be in the workplace. If I signal to my boss that I don't need to be in the workplace in the long term, that might have negative consequences for me. So.
Very, very good explanation. Very good reflection. it could be an opportunity to countries around the world also. It's a problem for you American workers, but could be an opportunity to other countries.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But okay, Professor, I think we don't have any more questions. I really want to thank you very much for your participation, for your contribution. It was very, very good. I think everybody enjoyed it and liked it. I don't know if Professor Anna want to talk something, if it's okay.
No, just to say thank you. It was a very good lecture. Thank you, Professor.
Sure. Thank you for having me. And I know I've talked a lot to Rafael about collaborations between your university and our university, certainly at our departmental level. And Rafael has been talking to the Associate Provost Ahmed Ezzedine, you may or may not be familiar with that name, about keeping the collaborations going. Unfortunately, COVID-19 interrupted our plans, but I'd love us to keep the collaborations going, and hopefully after this ends, we can programs or joint research activities, whatever you'd like to do. I'd be happy to pursue them.
Well, in fact, we have some ideas, but we will talk about later. Thank you, Professor.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. And thank you for everyone that was here with your contributions, your questions. And thank you all. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Yeah, goodbye.